Welcome back. This is the second video on Augustine. In this video we'll be looking at epistemology and value theory, and again you'll need to use the worksheet. At least I would encourage you to use the worksheet, and we'll be working our way through epistemology. As we come to look at his epistemology, again, we're going to be dealing with the fact that he speaks philosophy out of his theology, and his theology forms the background to his philosophy. But his philosophy is using categories of philosophy that were in use at the time, and he's using philosophical traditions which were respected intellectually at the time. In particular, he is very interested in the Neoplatonist perspective, although he is going to make sure that while he uses some of the ideas there, he's going to shape them in a way in which they help him understand his faith. So he's more interested in the structure of his faith, but he wants to make sure that what he says about philosophy makes sense. And maybe he's not just wanting to say something in philosophical terms for the sake of that, he wants to say something meaningful. So we're going to look at faith-seeking understanding, God, truth and certainty, and then how God illuminates the mind, which is the doctrine of illumination. Interesting doctrinal idea. Back to universals, and we'll talk about that for a while, and then we'll talk about the overall picture of faith and reason, which is a debate which has been coming out of the growing influence of Christianity and its interaction with the Greek and Roman philosophical world. So with that in mind, let's now move on and remind ourselves that the focus of Aristotle's approach to things was always twofold. And it's helpful for us to just revise that. The classical philosophers used philosophy to look for things like, what is the meaning of life? What's a good life? Is it a just life? Is it a virtuous life? What is it? And we talked about that in relation to Plato and Aristotle. Augustine's focus was on understanding the rationality behind his faith. Yes, he'll talk about what is a good life. When we come to look at his value theory, we'll see he's got a theory on that. And again, it comes from his understanding of faith, but again, he's going to reach across into philosophy. So, while Augustine's focus was on understanding how his faith comes together, it was his reasoning about God and truth that's significant, and by the way, had a significant influence on later philosophers, as we'll see. So, with that understanding, let's move on to what in the world did Augustine know? What did he know philosophically? How could he think about what he knew and justify saying he knew these things? In the background of the philosophical discussions, both in the time of Plato and the time of Aristotle, and also in Augustine's time, is that movement of the skeptics who insisted that you could know nothing for certain. And so that is the first movement he's going to interact with. He wants to say he does know something for certain. And he develops this doctrine, if you will, or this argument of existence as a predicate. This will come up again with Descartes, and you'll discover that Descartes is, in a sense, reaching back to Augustine, and so you'll see that here's the impact in later philosophy. On the screen you'll see here's, I think, one of his best statements about the matter. He knows that he exists. He says, if I am mistaken, I exist. He says, since therefore I must exist to be mistaken, then even if I'm mistaken, there can be no doubt that I am not mistaken about my knowledge that I exist. I may be mistaken about many things, but the thing I can be sure of is that I exist. Even if I'm mistaken about that, I can't do that unless I exist. It's an interesting argument. We hear the echo of that when we turn to Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So the first thing he says, I know I exist. And then he goes on to say, well, what else do I know? Well, he says, I know there are some universal and eternal truths that I can discover in mathematics. And obviously, something which is universal and eternally true is going to be truly true. And he picks on 7 plus 3 equals 10. And he explains that 7 plus 3 equals 10 always equals 10. There's no time and no place where it does not equal 10. And so he comes to this conclusion. Therefore, I have said that the truth of number is incorruptible and common to all who think. So he knows about the existence of mathematical ideas, and these mathematical ideas, he means us in the widest sense of math. And so that's the first thing he says. That's the second thing he says he knows. He's got to keep building on this. Now, can he move on from this to know other things? Other things that are incorruptible, eternal, inviolable truths. And what he does, he uses interesting concepts to say that these concepts are known to us all and they're always true. And he picks on the superlative concepts. And these are interesting concepts. Look at the first quote, which comes to us from Free Choice. Will you deny that the incorruptible is better than the corrupt, the eternal better than the temporal, and the inviolable better than the violable? These are the truths that he sees everyone knows and understands, and they are incorruptible, eternal, and inviolable. In other words, they're powerful truths which stand the test of time anywhere. And he goes on to say of these incorruptible and eternal and inviolable truths that one ought to hold a view of the happiness of life in terms of these inviolable things. Because he's going to talk about the happy life in terms of that can't be taken away from you. Things you desire that cannot be taken away from you. In this actually you can hear an echo of Aristotle's view of happiness, but we'll come back to that later. So the other important thing that he wants to conclude is that such truths as these superlative truths are not something we create in our own minds. They're not a human invention. They're something so common to all men that they're beyond the individual man's creativity or creation. And he expresses that in the second quote I have for you there. Truth, remaining in itself, does not gain anything when we see it, or lose anything when we do not see it. It is whole and uncorrupted. With its light, truth gives joy to the men who turn to it, and punishes with blindness those who turn from it. Now, it's in this sense that he wants to say that such truths that are eternal and incorruptible, in a sense, have an existence. They have a reality to them. Here, of course, we can hear echoes of Plato's idea of forms. Non-material entities from Aristotle. They're eternally universal, and they're absolutely certain. So he concludes, we know that we exist, we know the mathematical truth exists, and we can conceive the superlative truths. And one might ask the question, well, how do these fit in with the chain of being? Well, obviously, if they are eternal truths, and they are truths that are incorruptible, they are truths that, in a sense, exist outside of time. Which means, if they exist outside of time, on that chain of being, they're way up the top. And that means they're going to be in God in some way. And that, of course, brings us back to the place and question of God, and, of course, back to his theology. All right, we're back to Augustine's theology for a moment in relation to the theology of God. What is important in Augustine's theology, which, remember, is a reflection of Christian theology, is that God of the Bible is viewed as having some essential characteristics, attributes. And one of those attributes is truth. So that in biblical terms, a theologian would say, God is truth. He wouldn't say God speaks truth, but God is truth. Truth does come out of God's mouth, figuratively speaking, but it comes out because he is truth. It's both an ontological and an epistemological statement. And as a result of that theology, when Augustine comes to do philosophy, he's got to ask himself, how can I deal with that in terms of philosophy, my chain of being, and all the philosophical debates that have gone on? And so, when philosophically he asks the question, what is God? And is God real? Does he really exist? He comes up with this definition. You can see it on the screen. God is that to whom no one is superior. Again, think of the chain of being. He is at the top of the chain of being. He is complete perfection. He is complete existence. He is completely holy. And now we're seeing he is truth. He is eternal truth. He is truth itself. Now God is at that pinnacle of being. And so this means that for Augustine, he needs to discuss an argument for the existence of God, which is consistent with what he's already been talking about. Remember, he's established so far that truth is real and that truth exists outside of time. So he's going to have an argument that's somehow got to connect God and truth. Now, he's not going to care, philosophically, whether God and truth are simply interchangeable or two separate things, so long as he established God exists and there's an inseparable connection between them. And so Melchett sets out, in his own terms, a summation of Augustine's argument for the existence of God. And I'll turn your attention to it. It's on page 269. No, I meant to reproduce it here in the PowerPoints, but I forgot to do so. Melchett summarizes it this way. He makes a statement. Number one, God, by definition, is that to whom no one and nothing is superior. Truth exists and is superior to us. Now, Augustine's established that in the previous discussion we had when he went from self-knowledge, mathematical knowledge, and to superlative concepts. And so he goes on to say, if nothing's superior to truth, then God is the same as truth. And what's more, God exists. Melchett goes on summarizing Augustine's argument. If there's something superior even to truth, then the only thing that's superior can be God, by definition. And hence, he would argue that God exists. And either way, he's establishing, using the concept of truth to establish that God exists. He's happy with the conclusion that both truth and God exist, and that they may be one or even philosophically interchangeable. But as far as he's concerned, he's established the existence of God. And that's going to be important because he wants to go one step further. And that's his doctrine of divine illumination. Now, I've summarized it for you in terms of what's underlined in the top of the screen under divine illumination. God giving humans the insight the wisdom, the understanding into the truth of the information we already have, we already know. What's the information we already have? Well, we have knowledge of self, we have knowledge of mathematics, we have knowledge of superlatives. And he wants to go one step further. Because when he looks at the knowledge of self and knowledge of mathematics and knowledge of superlatives, the things we already have that are common to all men, he wants to call this knowledge of experience. It's the knowledge we experience, and perfectly valid to talk about that way. He's not making the distinction that we know these things by experience, but it's the knowledge we experience in life, a subtle difference, but important one. Now, what is important to him is that this experimental knowledge that we have is in fact an analogue of the true, divine, eternal knowledge, which is universal. It's an analogue of it. So true knowledge and experiential knowledge, or knowledge we experience, I think it is perhaps helpful to let Augustine speak for himself on this kind of knowledge. We hear him from the Confessions. Let's just take one of these quotes. You can read the rest for yourselves. The mind needs to be enlightened by light from outside itself. Why? So that it can participate in truth. Because it, that is the mind, is not itself the nature of truth, or the source of truth, if you will. And again, as so often the case in the Confessions, he speaks to God. You will light my lamp, Lord. Well, he's established the idea of divine hallucination. How does it work? Remember, the objective here is that somehow God is providing insight into the truth of the information we already have. And here, Augustine is arguing that the mind of God and the thoughts of God are inherently beyond the mind we have and the thoughts we have. God lives and speaks out of an eternal present, whereas we live and speak out of time. His language reflects the eternal present. Our language reflects time and our immediate circumstances. So our language is different from God, the true Word of God. And he wants us to respect that difference, because what he sees as the role of illumination is a divine illumination gives us insight into the truth. And I think this little quote I've got for you from his handbook, De Magistra. When I speak the truth, he's speaking here as a preacher or as a teacher, when I speak the truth, I do not teach something. I do not teach someone who sees the truth. For he is not taught by my words, but by the things themselves made manifest within when God discloses them. And the bold at the bottom summarizes, I think, for you. Augustine believes that eternal truth is not so much discovered by man, by his reasoning, his reflection, his experimentation, but rather it's humbly received by the believing heart. Now, before we can move on to value theory, we need to come to two other issues. The first is universals, and the second is going to be faith and reason. Now, you'll recall that we pointed out that Plato had his universal forms. These were his universals, the things that everybody knew. There were universal truths everywhere, and we all could relate to them and have objective knowledge. Essentially, Aristotle had his essences, form and essence, or form, if you will, form and matter, universal concepts, universal ideas. Bottom line was that Aristotle recognized there had to be some kind of universal basis for knowledge. And here's just a little awkward to follow at times, but the same basic idea. And again we'll see that Augustine's operating out of that same framework. There has to be some objective standard to which we all can relate for knowledge. And what Augustine is basically saying is that to know something, you have to turn away from the world as the source of knowledge, but only turn to the mind of God. For remember the chain of being again. It is in the mind of God that all eternal truth exists, all these eternal ideas, if you will, these forms. Where do forms exist for Augustine? They exist in the mind of God. They exist in the mind of God. Now, the discussion of universals is going to continue, as it does down to this very day, in various ways. And after Augustine, and we're just looking at the period from Augustine through to Aquinas at this point, there arose a distinction between particulars and generals. Generals were a general category of universal things, such as whales, or ships, or houses, or mankind. Particulars were individual things of the species, an individual whale, a blue whale. And it's an interesting distinction. And the Platonic realists continued to represent Plato's view that the forms were real and had a separate existence in a separate world. Anselm, who comes after Augustine, says universals as well as species are real. This is a more difficult argument to follow. Modern realism tends to say that universals are simply real concepts shared among mankind. Conceptualism says universals are mere concepts, and nominalism, well, universals are just names given to a particular idea. William of Ockham and Russell have those views. We will just note those in passing. Aquinas is going to follow on the tradition of Aristotle. Copleston, probably the most famous Roman Catholic philosopher of history, controversial character, Jesuit priest, in his great work, describes Aquinas as having a view of resemblance, nominalists. It's quite an interesting discussion. He says, the form is the universal element which assigns an object its class. And so there's a relationship between a thing and its class. Well, I'm not going to go into those details now, but simply point out there is an ongoing development in universals. And when we come to Aquinas, we'll come back to that topic in just a little more detail. But the point of showing you this, of course, is to again show you that Augustine is setting the scene for philosophical discussion and debate after his own lifetime. One last topic before we move to value theory. Augustine's view on faith and reason is, on the one hand, a profound commitment to grace and scripture and revelation from God, and at the same time, a profound respect for philosophy. We've already noted some of the various church fathers had views on this question of how faith relates to reason. Indeed, before, well, even since, people have said this is the debate between Athens and Jerusalem. Justin Martin, for example, said that he doesn't love the philosophy of Plato. And he used philosophy to, particularly Plato's philosophy, to interpret the world. Tertullian was just exactly the opposite. He said, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Hence the Athens and Jerusalem debate. Origen of Alexander accepted the most useful and edifying principles to elucidate Christian faith. In some sense, he's in the tradition of Augustine. Augustine, on the other hand, his approach was to use philosophy to understand his own faith, and in some senses to help the world to see, and along with himself, to see that in Christianity there is a rationality, and that it makes sense, and is worthy of serious intellectual consideration. His view can be summed up under the saying, faith seeking understanding. He didn't actually say that, but it sums him up his views. Again, Augustine sets the scene for the future. He has faith seeking understanding. But after his work, up to the time of Thomas Aquinas, there developed within Christendom a concept of the double truth. That is, there's philosophical truth, it's in this box, and there's theological or religious truth in this box, and the two have no correlation whatsoever. They're both equally important and equally significant. And that position for Christian thinkers was fine until the beginning of the scientific era, when suddenly a tension developed between philosophy, including science, and religious truth, on the other hand. How to fit these two together. And the first person, as this modern tension grew between philosophical truth and religious truth, to really address was going to be Thomas Aquinas. And we'll turn to him in our next lecture to hear him address the faith and reason debate and how they can be related or how they can be reconciled. And we will come to that. Now let's turn our attention to the question of Augustine's value theory. Augustine's value theory. We'll have a brief look at the question of the good life and move on to a discussion of human nature, then free will and determinism, and you can see the remaining topics including the nature of evil and the two cities. This is the direction we're going to move in, so we'll start our discussion first and foremost with the good life. For most philosophers, at the heart of philosophical discussion is what is the good life? What's happiness? What is life all about? These are first order questions, big questions, important questions, and a very important question. And happiness is achieved by desiring and having the highest good, which is to be found in true wisdom. And that's, in a sense, not unlike Aristotle's view. It's not like Plato's view, but there's a reflection here where he's saying happiness is having and acquiring. Aristotle, of course, is more concerned with the totality of life, being a good life. But here happiness is that you have your desire on the highest good, and that highest good you come to understand in terms of true, divine, eternal wisdom. And so, for Augustine, the issue of the good life is a matter of having the right desires along with the right exercise of the human will. But there's an interesting question for Augustine. Remember, this is the man who struggled with the good life, had a dramatic conversion, who has come to a view of mankind and sin that leads him with the concern, is it possible for anyone to truly achieve the good life, to be happy? Is it possible? His good answer is going to be yes, but it's going to be a different kind of answer. Because here we find ourselves back considering Augustine's theology and biblical teaching, again which is reflective of then traditional Christian teaching and doctrine. And we're going to find him trying to make sense philosophically of what he's been discovering the Bible teaches about man. He's going to be very comfortable with finding it as an answer to help him understand his own experience and what he sees in the world around him. But first, let's look to what the Bible teaches about man. Man was originally created by God, and he was made a reflection of the divine being. The Bible says he was made in the image of God. He was created out of the dust of the earth, and God breathed into him and he became a living soul, a body and soul unity. And when God created him and placed him along with Eve in the Garden of Eden, according to the biblical narrative, he had the freedom of choice. He could eat of any tree, the fruit in the garden, and he was accustomed to knowing God and speaking with God personally. There was only one injunction which was negative, and that was that he could not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Unfortunately, that was the choice Adam and Eve made, and that's called original sin. They chose to disobey that command, and they were put out of the garden. And the consequences of that being placed out of the garden, and the earth being cursed, and death beginning to reign in mankind's experience, and the Bible's commentary from the Old Testament into the New, that the thoughts and imaginations of the human heart are evil continually. It will leave you with the view that man really has a sin problem, a disobedience problem. However, Augustine, following the Apostle Paul, doesn't want to understand sin purely in terms of doing naughty things. Let's listen to the Apostle Paul. This is a passage which, in fact, Augustine quotes. Paul says, "For I know that nothing good dwells in me." This follows that Old Testament idea that the thoughts and imaginations of every heart are evil continually. "Nothing good dwells within me in my flesh." And then he adds a very important statement. Because remember, the good life is having the right desire. And the Apostle Paul is teaching Augustine that I have the right desire to do what is right, but I do not have the ability to carry it out. I have a problem with my ability to actually do what I know is right. Sin, the thing by which judgment is passed on a person in terms of the biblical narrative, is not so much found in what we do, but in the state of the human desire. The real condemnation comes from having a sinful heart, a self-centered and ignorant heart, a heart that's ignorant of eternal truth and wisdom, a heart that does what it wants to do, and not what wisdom would dictate. And hence this human will is fallen because it's bent away from God, bent away from holiness, and it is bent toward ignorance and selfishness. Sin is a manifestation of what we desire. And if our desires are wrong, then we're not going to find happiness. And again, you can see, if you go to the chain of being, you'll see that you have the desire for goodness is at the top, where God is, where holiness is. And when we don't desire what God's, the opposite direction, of course, is nothingness, the right-hand column again, you see. This chain of being becomes a central chord of structure and thinking, not just of his epistemology and ontology, but also of his value theory. But when you go on from what the Bible teaches about man, begin to think about what that's going to mean in terms of philosophy. You're going to transition now. Man is made in the likeness of God. That means that he can think, he's reasoning, he can reason just as God can reason. He's got moral judgment just as God has got that. He's got something called a free will, and he's accountable for his actions. At the same time, the biblical story, just like the chain of being, there's that gap between God and the creation. There's a huge distinction there. The creator-creature distinction has to always be maintained. And as already noted, the soul is an immaterial reality. This is some sense echo here of Aristotle, as distinct from the material body. And it's the soul that has the facility of reason and choice, and hence that's where the moral character of a person rests. The heart is in the soul. Now, this kind of being is morally accountable. He has a free will, or she has a free will, but that will is defective. And why is it defective? Because it chooses to seek after disordered love. It chooses to seek after disordered love. That's its bent. Its choice orientation is to choose after disordered love. Now, if you remember the chain of being, that means that instead of choosing toward holiness and righteousness, it chooses to love not the good things, but to love nothingness, which is the bottom of that chain of being. It chooses darkness rather than light. Now, it's in this sense that Augustine wants to say we have a defective free will. And in this he's standing over against the Pelagians. Pelagius taught that when Adam fell in sin, he was a Christian philosopher who led a heretical movement in North Africa primarily. He taught that Adam's will was impacted, but every person born after Adam was born with a genuine free will, just like Adam had in the Garden of Eden. Now, Augustine wants to stand over against this and maintain the biblical position on original sin. We've discussed that above already. He wants to maintain that original sin impacts all human beings, so that their free will is defective. It's a will that chooses defective love. And this love chooses nothingness rather than holiness. But at the same time, he doesn't want to find it the full mistake of the Manichaeans. He wants to say, well, there's like battle between light and darkness, and here we are in the middle, and we can't help it. Woe is us. He says, no, we're personally responsible for our evil choices. We are accountable. So there's a sense he has two things in tension here. We have free will, but that free will is defective, and we're still going to be held accountable for the defective decisions we make because of it. And that defective free will we owe to our first parents, Adam and Eve. So let's hear Augustine's words as he summarizes this up for us in his manual. So when sin was committed by free choice, sin became the victor and free choice was lost. Well, what's the solution to this problem? If I'm in this mess where I have a defective free will, how am I going to overcome this defective free will? And the answer, of course, is to that which has often been said to be a central theme in Augustine, and that is the grace and love and mercy of God. And indeed, you can't read the confessions without being impacted by that. He turns again to the Apostle Paul, and Paul's answer comes in Romans chapter 7. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. Now, what's important for us to note here is that the solution to mankind's problem is not seen in terms of ignorance. For example, that was Plato's view. The problem of bad things happening in the world was ignorance. And to some extent it was Aristotle's as well. But rather, the problem is a problem of the human will. And we need a converted and changed will. That will needs to be delivered from its evil tendencies to wholeness and to holiness. And of course, that dilemma of the human heart is that it doesn't have the capacity to make that change because it's defective. And so the change of heart requires divine grace to come into a person's life. The heart to make the heart change. And what's more, divine grace is needed, according to Augustine, throughout the whole of life, enabling the heart to continue. One of the most quoted prayers of Augustine sums it up this way. Give me the grace to do as you commanded, and command me to do as you will. A little aside for a moment on grace and virtue. I just let you look at this briefly. The virtuous life, it is the ordered love life, life of ordered love in action, to be distinguished from disordered love. Ordered love produces charity. And here it's important to see the definition. It's the desire of the soul to enjoy God, to enjoy oneself, and to enjoy one's neighbour for the sake of God. Not for one's own sake, what you get out of it, but for God's sake. Disordered love, or cupidity, is the desire of the soul to enjoy self, others, and things for the sake of something other than the sake of God. And cupidity leads to vice, and vice ultimately to crime. We won't spend much time going in that direction, but we'll just see how the system works through. Now, we need to look at the nature of evil. In a sense, we have been seeing this whole discussion on the right-hand side of the chain of being, the model that we took from Melchett's textbook. Here we are turning to the question of theodicy. In the next video, we'll talk about theodicy in greater detail, look at the various solutions that have been suggested. All we're doing here is taking note of how Augustine responds to the question of theodicy. What's theodicy? Theodicy is how do you justify divine goodness and providence in view of the existence of evil. In other words, it's kind of defending God from the accusation that he's the author of evil. Augustine rejects the Manichaeans' view. Their view was that there are two competing forces, the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Frankly, there's something very attractive about that, and much of modern drama is made up of this battle between the forces of good and darkness, battling things out. The biblical story doesn't reject that idea, but what's important, it is not the explanation for evil. He rejects that. Because we're not victims in the midst of a battle being pulled around by forces we can't control. And to help him reject that kind of answer, he wants to make some distinctions. First, the distinction between moral evil and natural evil. Now, natural evil are things like illness, bad things that happen to us, that arise in the world of experience that aren't a consequence or don't come about because of the rational choices of free agents. And natural evil is really, let's go back to moral evil first. Moral evil is the evil that arises by the decisions of free agents, the things that we do, we who have the responsibility for making moral free choices. Let's just go back quickly to the chain of being. Here in the chain of being, in the right-hand column, you'll see that Augustine sees at the height of the right-hand side of his chain of being, yes, we have eternity up there, but we have God and we have complete goodness. And you come down the chain of being on the right-hand side, you'll see you come down, you reach nothingness. And with that in mind, Augustine wants to say that if God is perfect goodness and existence, perfect being, then going downward each level is to go down to a lesser level of existence and being, and hence a lesser level of holiness and goodness. By the time we reach the bottom level of nothingness, what we realize is that natural evil is simply a privation of goodness. It's further and further away from God. Hence, natural evil is nothingness. It's nothing at all. Now, he's satisfied with that. He's made God no longer the author of natural evil. And that debate will go on, and we won't go to that here. We'll come back to that in the third video. But what is moral evil then? It's the action of moral evil agents. But note the dilemma that arises here, because even Romans 19 puts it, "For I do not do the good I want, but I do the very evil that I don't want to do." So we move on then to, how does this explanation affect the veracity of God's knowledge and his foreknowledge? Let's try and put that in its context. If it is true that we can use his definition of natural evil as being nothingness, God hasn't got to stand to account for it, at least in Augustine's terms. But God did create human beings. And there's a sense in which when he looked down at his creation, he could foreknow and foresee that human beings would engage in moral evil choices. So how does Augustine exempt God from some element of responsibility for standing back and allowing human beings to make evil moral choices? Now, first and foremost, does God have foreknowledge? Well, yes, he has to. That's a part of his perfection. So he's able to foresee everything that comes about. So what does he do? Essentially, and he makes an interesting statement in the City of God. The fact that God foreknew that man would sin doesn't make man sin. The fact that I might foresee someone do something doesn't mean I made them do it. And that's his explanation. Well, we can debate whether that's a satisfactory explanation or not. It's an interesting distinction. There's some credibility to it and some rationality to it. But again, in the next video we'll come back to it and further discuss it. Our purpose here is simply to know what his answer is. His solution to natural evil is that it's nothingness. Human evil is the evil action of free agents. And just because God foreknew that free agents would do this doesn't make the particular person sin. Let's just step aside for a moment in preparation for our discussion of the City of God and talk about the Donatist controversy. Dates here are important. The close of the Constantine became the first Christian emperor, and Christians had suffered considerable persecution up to that time, particularly during the reign of Domitian. It had been a time in which the Christian church struggled to identify itself, to come to better understand its own biblical doctrine and teaching. It had had all kinds of strange aberrations imposed upon it. And the church itself had experienced people who had become martyrs and people who had become, in a sense, apostate. They had gone over to the other side. They'd offered sacrifices to the Roman gods. But the decree of Milan brought the legalization of Christianity in the empire, and peace reigns in the empire, as it were. It is not the 396 that Augustine becomes Bishop of Hippo, but by that time a deep and bitter controversy had been developing within the Christian church, which came out of the struggles through the persecutions. It's called the Donatist controversy, and Augustine became embroiled in this because the Donatist controversy was one that was primarily associated with North Africa, and of course he was Bishop of Hippo in North Africa. Donatist Magnus became a leader of a schismatic group within the Christian church, and he must have been a charismatic character because he was able to impact lots of people. And his argument was very interesting. He argued that for Christian clergy to have the right to be clergy, to perform the sacraments, they had to be faultless in their ministry. So if a person had capitulated and offered sacrifices to the Roman gods in order to survive the persecutions, they couldn't be part of the church, they couldn't receive the sacrament, they couldn't become priests. This issue divided the church. The Emperor Constantine, when he made Christianity the official religion, he began to become embroiled in helping to settle church disputes. And in a sense, he began to enforce ecclesiastical decisions. And this is something that was a concern to Augustine, because he wanted to receive all Christians back into the church. He wanted a church unified, and he did not want to exclude from clergy or exclude from the sacraments those who had compromised during those difficult times. In a sense, it's a reflection of his view of grace. If God could forgive him and take him and make him a priest and then make him a bishop, surely those who had merely offered sacrifices to strange gods couldn't be anywhere as bad as he is. I'm making that up. I'm trying to get to the mind of the man who just was so enamored with grace that he just did not want to see people excluded because of a past sin, of failing to be courageous enough. It's always very difficult for us to deem someone who compromises in the midst of persecution to be a sinner, but the Dante certainly did. He opposed that. And that brings us to his great tome, The City of God. This is a very large work, and in some senses it is a rewriting of Roman history, especially in terms of the role of the Roman gods. You see, as well as the empire becoming Christian, the empire was becoming weaker. And there were those who were seeing the various catastrophes taking place on the borders of the empire as catastrophes that had come about because the empire had moved away from the ancient gods. And so there's a sense in which the book is an apologetic. But it also does something else quite significant, at least as far as we're concerned at this point in our coursework. Augustine was to establish that there are two communities within every community. There is the Christian church community, and there is the general city community, a city within a city. He wants to argue that the Christian community is spiritual, and that the secular city, or the regular city, the political city, is a city of the world. And he talks about the city of God versus the city of man, a church versus state, if you will, the heavenly city versus the earthly city. This really begins in earnest in Book 11 of the two cities. Now, what's important here is that from our perspective, this is an embryonic discussion of the concept of separation of church and state. Also, a reason for arguing with the emperor that he should not be embroiled in the decision-makings of the church. Now, he is a little ambiguous on that particular topic, but nonetheless, he really seems to lay the foundation for this great concept of the separation of church and state, and what the relationship between the two. And that's going to be problematic in Western civilization for a long time. Well, I'll leave you with that little discussion on the city of God. And all we need to say for this course is that you know what the city of God is and what the city of man is. The city of God is the Christians, and the city of man is the community as a whole, including Christians. That brings us to our famous red slide. Again, this red slide is a reflection of your study sheet. I encourage you to make sure you're filling it in and going over it. Thank you for watching, and I'll leave you to go over the details and the PowerPoints. I hope they'll be helpful to you, and you can use the textbook to sort of fill in gaps, and between those things you will have a solid foundation of the work and teaching of Augustine.